There's a common belief that birds come back because they remember where the food is. After spending so many mornings watching wrens in my own backyard, I'm not so sure that's the whole story. I think something far more interesting happens first. Long before a little wren decides to land on your fence, your feeder, or even the branch outside your window, it has already been watching you. Not just your backyard, you. The way you walk outside each morning, the sound of your footsteps, the time you open the back door, how quickly you move, even how often you stop and simply stand still. And over time, those tiny observations begin to form a pattern. I sometimes wonder if wrens don't just memorize places, they memorize people. Not in the way we remember a face, but in the quiet, practical way a wild creature decides whether the world around it is becoming safer or less predictable. That's what changed the way I look at my own backyard. Because once I started paying attention, I realized the birds weren't simply visiting my garden. They were slowly adjusting their lives around mine. And when I finally understood why, it explained something that had puzzled me for years. Why one tiny wren kept coming closer, while another never returned at all. For years, I believed the same thing most people do. If the feeder was full, the birds would come. If they disappeared, I probably needed better seed, or a different feeder, or maybe they had simply moved on. That explanation seemed perfectly reasonable, until one spring morning when something happened that didn't quite fit. A little Carolina wren had been visiting almost every day for weeks. Not close enough for me to touch, of course, but close enough that I had begun recognizing its tiny habits. It always landed on the same fence post first, paused for just a second, looked around, then flew down to feed. It repeated that routine so consistently that I almost expected it every morning. Then one day, I stepped outside much earlier than usual. I was in a hurry. Instead of walking slowly across the yard like I always did, I crossed the grass quickly, carrying a ladder to trim a low tree branch. The wren was already there. It saw me, froze, and vanished before I had even reached the feeder. That alone wasn't surprising. Wild birds startle easily, but what happened afterwards stayed with me. The next morning, the feeder was full. The weather was calm. Everything looked exactly the same. Except the wren didn't come, nor the morning after that. It returned several days later, but something had changed. It stayed farther away. It spent longer watching before landing, almost as if it needed to verify that my strange behavior had not become my new routine. I can't prove that's what the bird was thinking, no one can. But after watching wrens for so many years, I've learned they're constantly measuring one thing above almost everything else. Not kindness, not generosity, predictability. To a tiny bird living one day at a time, a predictable human is often a safer human. And once I began looking at my own habits through that lens, I started noticing dozens of little behaviors that I had completely overlooked before. Some of them were quietly inviting birds closer. Others were pushing them away, without me realizing it. One of the biggest surprises for me was realizing that trust isn't built through grand gestures. It grows through repetition. Looking back, I can think of dozens of mornings that felt completely uneventful to me. I walked outside, filled the feeder, changed the water, sat quietly for a few minutes, then went back inside. Nothing remarkable happened. At least, that's what I thought. But from a wren's point of view, those quiet mornings were anything but ordinary. Each peaceful visit confirmed something. Yesterday was safe. Today feels the same. Maybe tomorrow will be too. That's how confidence begins. Not all at once, but through hundreds of tiny moments that rarely seem important while we're living them. It's funny, when people ask me how to attract more birds, they usually want to know which seed I recommend first, or which feeder works best. Those things certainly matter, but I've come to believe they matter less than most people imagine. Because a beautiful feeder placed in a stressful environment is still part of a stressful environment. Birds don't experience your backyard as a collection of objects. They experience it as a series of moments. They notice whether the same chair is always on the porch, whether the garden suddenly becomes noisy every afternoon, whether the family dog rushes across the lawn without warning, whether people move calmly or unpredictably. Even small changes can briefly reset the careful confidence they've been building. That doesn't mean you have to walk on eggshells in your own backyard. Not at all. Life happens. Children play. Lawns get mowed. Guests come over. Branches get trimmed. Birds understand that the world isn't perfectly quiet. What seems to matter far more is the pattern that returns afterward. Do things settle back into the familiar rhythm they've learned? Or does the environment keep changing faster than they can adapt? The more I watched wrens, the more I realized they were never looking for perfection. They were looking for consistency. And honestly, I think there's something quietly comforting about that. Not just for birds, for us too. We all relax a little easier in places that feel familiar. Maybe that's one reason I enjoy sitting on my porch so much. The yard hasn't become peaceful because the birds arrived. Perhaps the birds arrived because the yard had already become peaceful. That thought stayed with me for a very long time, because it made me wonder if I had been trying to attract birds when I should have been creating a place that simply invited them to stay. For a long time, I believed I was trying to attract birds. It sounds like a small difference, but one day I realized it wasn't true. I wasn't trying to convince wrens to visit anymore. I was trying to give them one less reason to leave. That realization changed almost everything I did. I stopped thinking about how to make my backyard more interesting and started thinking about how to make it feel more dependable. Because when a wild bird returns, it isn't making a promise, it's making another decision. Every single visit is a quiet vote of confidence, a tiny life saying, "Yesterday felt safe enough to come back." I don't think we appreciate how remarkable that really is. A wren spends every day surrounded by uncertainty, predators, storms, competition, changing seasons. Its entire life depends on making thousands of tiny decisions correctly. So when that same little bird begins treating your backyard as part of its daily routine, that's not something to take for granted. It's something to be grateful for. I've seen people become discouraged because birds only visited once or twice. They assumed they had failed. But trust rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it begins with nothing more than a brief stop on a fence, then a visit to a nearby branch. Weeks later, a quick look at the feeder, and before you realize it, that tiny visitor has quietly woven your backyard into its own daily map of the world. Those are the moments I've come to treasure most, not because the birds needed me, but because they no longer seemed uncertain about me. Over the years, friends and neighbors kept asking how my yard became so consistently full of birds. The truth was never a secret recipe or a special feeder. It was a collection of small observations, little mistakes, and quiet lessons that slowly changed the way I understood trust. Eventually, I gathered everything I had learned into the Backyard Bird Trust Guide. Not because I thought everyone needed another bird book, but because I wanted to give people a shortcut through the years of trial and error that taught me these lessons. If you've ever wished your backyard felt a little more alive, or wondered why birds visit once but never seem to stay, I think you'll genuinely enjoy it. You'll find a link just below this video if you'd like to take a look. Because sometimes, the smallest changes are the ones birds notice first. The more time I spent watching wrens, the more I realized that feeding was never the beginning of the story. It was usually the end. By the time a little wren hopped onto the feeder, dozens of silent decisions had already been made. Most of them happened before its feet ever touched the wood. If you've ever watched a wren carefully, you may have noticed something curious. It rarely flies straight to the food. Instead, it stops. A nearby branch, a fence post, the top of a shrub, almost like a lookout. From there, it watches, not just for hawks or neighborhood cats. It watches the entire rhythm of the place. I've often sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, doing almost nothing at all. And after a few quiet minutes, the wrens would begin appearing one by one, never all at once. The boldest bird usually arrived first. It landed nearby, looked around, listened, and waited. Only after that first bird relaxed would another one sometimes follow. Watching this happen over and over made me wonder if trust spreads differently than fear. Fear can empty a backyard in seconds. Trust seems to arrive one careful decision at a time. Scientists have found that many birds are remarkably good at recognizing individual humans and learning from repeated experiences. Different species rely on this ability to judge potential threats and adjust their behavior over time. Wrens haven't been studied as extensively as crows or pigeons in this area, but they are highly observant birds that constantly learn from what happens around them. That doesn't mean a wren is sitting on a fence making complicated plans about you. Nature is usually much simpler than that. A bird survives by noticing patterns. Which gate opens every morning? Which dog always barks? Which child likes to run across the lawn? Which part of the yard suddenly becomes noisy? And which human quietly walks outside every day without causing trouble? From our perspective, these moments seem ordinary. To a bird that weighs less than an ounce, they become valuable information. Sometimes I imagine each peaceful morning adding one tiny stone to an invisible bridge. One calm visit, another predictable routine, another day without danger. Stone by stone, that bridge slowly becomes trust. And perhaps that's why so many people feel disappointed when birds visit once, then disappear. They're trying to build the bridge from the feeder outward, while the birds are trying to build it from safety inward. It's a small difference, but it changes almost everything. And perhaps that's the part we don't talk about often enough. People sometimes ask me how long it takes for birds to trust a backyard. I honestly don't know, because I don't think trust follows a calendar. I've seen wrens grow comfortable in a matter of weeks. I've also watched others keep their distance for months before taking that final step closer. Every backyard is different. Every bird is different, and every quiet interaction adds another small piece to a story we'll never fully see. That's one of the reasons I still enjoy sitting outside almost every morning. Not because I'm waiting for something extraordinary to happen, but because the ordinary has become extraordinary. A familiar song from the same little branch. A tiny shadow landing on the fence before breakfast, the soft rustle of wings in the shrubs. Moments that most people would probably walk right past. Sometimes I think we spend so much time trying to bring nature into our lives that we forget nature is already trying to understand us, not through words, not through emotions the way we experience them, but through patterns, consistency, and countless tiny observations that slowly answer one simple question. Is this place safe enough to return to? Maybe that's why the most rewarding backyard isn't the one with the biggest feeder or the rarest birds. Maybe it's the one where wild creatures begin behaving as though they already know tomorrow will feel much like today. To me, that's what trust looks like. And every time a little Carolina wren lands on the same fence post before flying down to feed, I like to imagine it's remembering something much more valuable than where the food is. That this small corner of the world still feels familiar, still feels peaceful, still feels safe. And when I think back to that first Carolina wren, I realize I spent years asking the wrong question. I kept wondering why one little wren slowly came closer, while another quietly disappeared. Today, I don't think either bird was trying to teach me a lesson. I simply believe they reached different conclusions from the lives they had lived. One found enough quiet moments to trust my backyard. The other may never have reached that point, or perhaps something beyond my little fence changed its journey before it ever had the chance. I'll never know for certain. And strangely, I'm at peace with that now, because trust isn't measured by whether every bird comes back. It's measured by every small reason you give them to return. So now I'm curious about your own backyard. Have you ever noticed one particular bird following a routine whenever you step outside? Or have you had a moment when a wild bird suddenly seemed far more aware of you than you expected? I genuinely love to hear your story in the comments. I read as many of them as I can. And some of my favorite observations have come from conversations with people just like you. Until next time, take a few extra minutes to sit quietly. You may discover that the birds have been paying attention to you much longer than you ever realized.